Before we get started with this lesson, I wanted to point out that I'm going to be making the examples that I have in this file here. I'm going to make this available on my Gumroad page. So if you load it up, what you will see is that you have the final file, and I've organized that into a top and bottom. So we have that to take a look at. I've also got a version that I've merged together. I also have some different camera views on here that are stored with the file for that. The other thing is, didn't really go over this in the file, but I still have this if you wanted to make your own custom brush. I have this where you can actually do something like this and do the grab doc. You'd have to change the document size. That's not really covered in the video, but I do have that in there as a shape if you wanted to at least take a look at that. And I also have something that was prepared for doing 3D printing. So if you wanted to print the top and then the bottom out for that, I'm actually doing a 3D print right now. So I have that with inside of there. And then the other thing that I have in this file is this, the blockout stage from this. So this is exactly what I had starting off the project, and if you wanted to follow along directly with some of the shapes that I have on things, you could load this part up within through there. So everything that you need to take a look at from the very beginning stages of starting things out all the way to the very final stages of how I took this and then I finished out all the detail and everything. You'll be able to take a look at that. So go ahead and visit my Gumroad page, download that, and I'm going to make that for free. The discount code for that will be UCF student, and you should be able to download that for free if you like. Okay, so hopefully that helps within taking a look at everything we're going to be taking a look at, and can definitely aid you in your process of trying to learn ZBrush. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at how we can add our secondary and tertiary details to the model. So in the previous video, we looked at how we could use ZBrush primitives to get all the bigger primary shapes. And then this is going to be all about doing secondary forms. So some of this like thicker kind of line work, and then tertiary forms is just this like little tiny surface noise. So let's go ahead and get into this and take a look at how we can finish up all the detail on our model. Okay, the first thing I want to highlight in this tutorial is that for a lot of the different brush strokes and things that I'll be using for this tutorial, I'm using a very specific brush pack, and it's by Michael Vicente. He goes by the name of Orb. And if you take a look here at his ArtStation account, you can go and you can find this post that he has on ArtStation. And you can go ahead and actually download his brush pack for free off of Gumroad, so you can get that. So what's really great about this, there's tons of different brushes on there, but we're going to utilize this Orb's Crack 2 brush that he's got, and that does some of these finer cracks that are within there. He's got a pinch brush too, and we'll take a look at how we use that to pinch up the ends of things. He also has some different brushes for doing some overall like rock noise and things like that. So again, it's just pretty amazing brush pack that he gives away for free. So go ahead and grab that. There's tons of tutorials out there of people using these brushes, and there's a reason for it. They're just I think they're amazing, especially for being free for you. So go ahead and download that brush pack and then take a look at that. The next thing that I wanted to show you is the way to effectively load in just alpha shapes and brushes that sit outside of the program. So it is possible that you can put brushes and alphas directly in the folder structure that comes with ZBrush, and you can do that. The only issue is that if you overload the program with too many materials or brushes and things like that, I've seen it cause problems with the program. Not being able to load the default stuff. So that's definitely an issue. So what I wanted to show you, there's a trick that I saw by Joseph Drust quite a while back, and it's basically this. I have a OneDrive, and you could be using Google Drive, it doesn't really matter. You could use Dropbox. I like to keep all my tools and things that I use on the cloud. Then that way, if anything happens to my computer or I need to get to them for any particular reason or share them out, it's really easy to do. So I've got this sitting on the OneDrive. I've made myself a ZBrush folder, and it's called ZBrush Tools, like this. And you can see I've made for all my brushes. So all my brushes sit within this folder for mine and the other people's that I've found, and then maybe just I got a loose folder. So it's tons and tons of stuff. I've got it pretty well organized. And in order to get this to load into ZBrush, I'm going to show you Lightbox and how we can get that in there. So it's pretty easy. I'm just going to take this brushes folder, and you just right click on this in Windows, and you want to make a shortcut for it, right? And if you don't see that within here, maybe you need to go to show more options, but you can make a shortcut like that, right? And so I've made a shortcut for my brushes folder, my alphas, materials, projects, and render sets. Okay. So once I have that shortcut, then I just go onto the C drive, program files, Pixelogic, wherever your version of ZBrush sits, go into there. And you can see there's some folders, and there's a ZBrushes folder, there's a Z alphas folder right here. Maybe you care about Z projects, that's what I made for that, and then maybe Z materials. So each one of those folders exists, and all you got to do is, like, if I go to the Z brushes and if I open that up, if I take that shortcut that I've got and I put it within there, if I go to ZBrush, all I got to do is hit the Lightbox key. And if we go to brushes, you can see that that shortcut is going to show up within here. And if you double click it, it's going to take you right to where your brushes sit. So it feels like it's like within Lightbox, and you don't have to do anything crazy with that, right? So if I go to other, and I've got a whole thing for Orb and his brushes, they're sitting there. He's also got some materials for you that are really nice to sculpt with. And let's say I'm going to use, I've already got this Orbs Crack 2 loaded, but let's say I want to use this Orbs Crack 1. I'll just double click it, and now it's loaded. And then if I hit the B key for my brushes, it should show up within the top here. So here's Orbs Crack, and I've already loaded Orbs Crack 2. So it's only going to stay in there every session. So every session you got to load it up, which I don't really think is that big of a deal. But it gives you tons of flexibility to kind of organize all your stuff that you've got and be able to do that. And again, I did the same thing with alphas. So I've got a shortcut for my alpha library that I've made. So I got a lot of different stuff within there, stuff that I've collected from other people as well. But it again, it just makes it super easy to be able to get to all these different shapes and whatnot, and then be able to do that. So that's how I'm going to suggest that you get the Orb brush set. And if you see me using one of his brushes, just go ahead and grab that and get it kind of set up the way that I do, and you should be able to follow along no problem. Okay, here we are inside of ZBrush, and if you remember from the previous tutorials, we've got a bunch of different subtools. We can actually hold on Alt, and we can click on whatever subtool that we want to work on. So I'm going to go for these cubes over here first, and if we did try to start sculpting on this, I'll tap X to turn on symmetry. It is possible that we can, but it's going to treat this as like it's some really big block that's kind of low res. The reason for that is we were using dynamic subdivision levels before. So whenever you're sculpting on something, even though it looks like this, if you hit Shift D, you're really sculpting on this, okay? And it's just updating the display for you. So what we need to do in order to get that to actually be geometry that we can sculpt on, let's go to the geometry section right here under Tool, open that up, and then you need to go to Dynamic, and you need to apply the dynamic subdivision levels, and that becomes actual subdivision levels that you can start sculpting on at that point. Okay, so now the behavior is going to be a whole lot different. If I sculpt on this, it's going to look like something like that, right? So we've actually got actual geometry to work with. Now, if you've never worked with subdivision levels before, don't worry. Not a big deal. We can take the slider and you can drag the slider to the left and you can see it can drop down and you can actually sculpt at various different subdivision levels, right? So it's kind of cool. If I sculpted that out, even if I put it on maybe the move brush, again for brushes, you might see mine on my interface that I've got here. You can go ahead and grab that from my Gumroad page. But if you want, you can tap B and then you can go to M and then you can find it there and then move. So all those brushes exist within the brush pack, and any of them are easy to find. We can just tap B and then S and then find the standard brush on there for that. So all those brushes exist. I would suggest is either making your own interface, and I've shown how to do that, or you're going to just go ahead and grab mine. Okay, if I put it on the move brush, so kind of the cool thing about subdivision levels is if I took this and I really tweaked out the shape quite a bit on the low res part, I don't even need to move very many parts and pieces for this. And then now if I want, I can step up in the subdivision level. So I'm at the lowest subdivision level. And if I go to the right, I'm going to the next subdivision level. And if I tap D, the hotkey for this is going up, D is, and then Shift D is the hotkey for going down in the subdivision levels. So you can see, you can do like large proportional changes to things, and the high res part moves around with it. Now, another thing that's kind of cool about this, I'll just put this on Damien Standard so you can see what's going on with this. Turn off the polyframe, and then I'll sculpt some detail on this. Okay, and let's just say I drop this down to the lowest subdivision level, and we want to maybe tweak the overall proportions again. Let's just go ahead and do that. Okay. And then now if I step up in the subdivision levels, I'll tap D. You can see all that high res detail that we sculpted will travel along with it. So it can be a really cool way of working. You just have to understand maybe a little bit about what's going on here with this. So let me get this and undo this all the way to the point where there was no changes to this. And if we wanted, we could use the undo slider that's back here. And if I step back too far, then I need to go back and apply that dynamic subdivision level for it. Okay. So one thing that you could do right off the bat to get even more rounded kind of corners on here, I've got a polish on my interface, and if you hold down control over any parts of the interface, you can see where it sits. So there's a whole lot of stuff under deformation. So let's take a look at that. Let's go to Tool, Deformation, and then Polish. So we'll go to Tool, Deformation, and then there's a Polish, and I've got that little donut hole thing unchecked, so it's going to be stronger. And I'm just going to drag it to the right, and then you can see how that rounds out these corners just a little bit more. So you can keep running it just a bit. And then the first thing I wanted to show you to beat up our edges is we're going to use the trim dynamic. So we use the polish first. And if we were talking about that artist Orb, Michael Vicente, I believe he's got this really nice look, and there's a whole lot going on with his edges, and his bevels look really nice, and you can see the highlights get picked up from the light from that when we do that polish. And then it looks like he's coming back through, and then he's taking maybe a trim dynamic, or there's flatten brushes. There's a couple different brushes we can take a look at, but let's just look at trim dynamic first, and we can start to beat up our corners on things. Now to speed things up, I do have symmetry turned on. We can turn on X for symmetry on the X axis, and that's going across this way. If you take a look at the face, this is the X axis right here going along in this area. So then I can just hit just a little bit of these every now and then. And depending on how much you want to tear up the edges, that's really up to you artistically, what you want to do with this. So I'm just rotating around the model. This is where I think it's pretty fun. So you get to make up your own little story of why you're damaging the thing in the way that you are, and giving it some type of visual history for things. So we can do that. Now if I use an H polish, that one looks at basically like this edge, and if I can push down on there, and if I go on this side and I push, I can get a really crisp edge on here with this H polish if you want something like that. Now, if you start in the middle of this, it's just going to push down a little bit. So depending on the look that you're kind of going for, I'm just going to get that beat up just a little bit more. The other thing I like with this H polish is if I tap U, I can get the intensity of this. I can drag the intensity up on this pretty high. If I drag it up pretty high, it really starts to push down on the surface, and I can do some things like this, what you see here, where I don't know, I'm just building some irregularities to the overall surface. Now, I don't want to beat it up too hard. If you hold down Alt, it'll actually pull up. And so you can use a combination of pushing down and then pulling up and then kind of going back over that just a little bit. If you make your brush size really small, you can get smaller detail to show up with that, like that. Okay. I think that's looking pretty cool. The other thing that I like to do with this H polish, I know this is moving a little bit forward too much. If I tap U and make it really intense and then tap S to make my brush size a lot smaller. If you want to do really small little divots, even that's pretty big. I'm going to undo that. You can use the bracket keys left and right if you ever want to just do like what Photoshop does for changing brush size. So I might get some little smaller pockets like that. And if you want to do just little divots every now and then, I think that's pretty good. And then if you ever want to fill things back in, so you see this divot here, if you put it in Trim Dynamic, this is pretty interesting. Hold on Alt and then just lightly tap on there and it fills that back in. So there's different ways that you could do that. You could smooth that out if you wanted to as well. Okay, so I think that's the basics of things, right? If you at least get that and get most of your edges kind of going, you're going to have a pretty decent look. You can see I did the pretty quick. I wouldn't consider this done. It's just a quick demonstration to show you basically how to use that. Let's go through and let's do one more. Let's go ahead and hold down Alt, and I'll just click on this. Again, we're just quick selecting things visually instead of coming up through the subtool and selecting it that way. But if you ever get confused as to what's selected, you should see it highlighted within here. Okay, again, if I just start to use Trim Dynamic on the corner of this, it's not really going to give me the behavior that I'm looking for. We need to go to Geometry. We need to go to Dynamic Subdiv. We need to apply that. And then we've got real subdivision levels that we can work with. Again, if you want to use the polish on there, you've got that on my interface. We can come back through for deformation. Just run the polish a few times just to get it to whatever the level is that you want. Now, if you're being very meticulous about this, you would be figuring out like what's the value. Like if you push this up to 100% and you did that 3 times, that's 300, and then maybe do 350 or something like that. And maybe you've got a very consistent look for your size. I'm not too worried about it. I'm just going visually off of what I see. And I'm just going to run through along some of the edges like that. And I'm not really even pushing all that hard with the brush to get this to lay down like this. And I do have symmetry on. Remember, you can tap X to turn on and off symmetry. Now, something else about symmetry. We do have symmetry turned on. So if I go to transform, and I'm going to click and drag this over and dock this just so you can all see what we've got going on here. So when we tap X, we're turning on and off symmetry. It's possible that you can also turn on Y and you can turn on Z as well. So I know this might be a little overkill and it makes it look like we're just repeating patterns over and over. But again, if you kind of hide this stuff, you can get away with at the very beginning where you can get a lot of the surface changed very quickly. And then once you've got enough change in the surface where we've got coverage everywhere, we don't want it to look like the same exact pattern. Like it looks like we just took this and mirrored it and flipped it across. So that becomes really obvious if we're too heavy-handed with that. But what we could do is after we get done to a certain point, we could maybe turn on just X symmetry and do some of that, right? And then after you do that for a little bit, then maybe you just turn off all symmetry altogether. And then you start doing some things that feel very specific. And that's how you can use symmetry to your advantage to try to speed up the workflow and not have to sculpt every single part of the thing. But then once you get to a certain point, you want to break symmetry, and then you want to make sure you're doing some very specific stuff in different areas. That way it hides the fact that you've used that technique on things. Okay. So there's a little bit about how to prep the surface using symmetry on things and to not use symmetry. Okay, let's talk about how we can take and make straight lines, something like this. Let's go ahead and I'll select this and I can draw this out. And what I'm using here for this, and I'll show you the setup, where you've got lazy mouse, but then we also am using the Orb's Crack 2 brush. Now we could use the Damien standard brush as well for this, and you can see this is what this brush would look like. It's got a nice crisp line, but it's kind of pillowy and it's soft as it builds up like this. It's a really good look. But then if we go and we use the Orb's Cracked 2 brush and we do that, you can see what the difference is here. It's still got a nice crisp line along through here, but then it's got this hard edge. So it almost feels like it's been carved into instead of, I don't know how to say this, like maybe the Damien standard you carved into it and then you soften the edges on there like that. And if we looked at things from a profile standpoint, this alpha, if we looked at really how it's digging into the surface, it kind of does something like this, right? So if this was the flat part of the surface, it's doing something like that, right? And if we looked at the Orb's Crack brush, it's doing something more like that in there. So that's the difference between those marks on there. So something else that you could use, you can tap B and then you go to C for chisel, and then they've got a bunch of different chisel brushes, and you could use these have different profiles on there that you could potentially use for this stuff too. You do have to have a lot of geometry to support those. So I'm just going to use this Orb's Crack 2 brush. Okay. Next thing, if I don't have lazy mouse turned on, let's take a look at this. So under stroke, if you click and you drag this over right here and you dock that, I'm going to close that up. If we take a look under stroke, we've got lazy mouse, and this is where all this stuff sits. I use this stuff enough to where I put it on my interface that I've got. You can always go to Gumroad, look for Nick, ZUCC, and go to the Gumroad page, and you can find all the different interfaces that I've made. So anytime you see anything on my interface, if you hold down Control, you could find out where this stuff sits. But this is all under stroke, right? So we are tapping L to turn on and off lazy mouse right here like this. And let's take a look at some of the different options for lazy mouse. So as I drag this thing out, if I have lazy mouse turned on, if I've got this lazy steps, if this is really, really high, you can see it's going to do dot, 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 right? And as it gets closer, those dots get closer and closer together until they're on top of each other. And then if you can put it down to 0 if you want. We've got that. I'm going to put this lazy step to like 0.01, something like that. Okay, so I get a nice clean line. The only thing is, when those dots build up on top of each other, it feels like it's strengthening that brush. So if you want to back off the depth of how far this is going in, when you push all the way in, you can tap U, or you can come to the intensity up here. Use the hotkey for the intensity. So if you tap U and then we drag this over, maybe 12. So we've got something pretty good there. And I'm going to hit undo. I'm going to tap S to make my brush size a little bit smaller, and then I want to find like what's the right size that I'm looking for to build the kind of detail that I'm looking for on this. Okay, so that's the step part. Now, if you have a lazy smooth, that's how much it's going to smooth that line as you're drawing with it, and the higher you go, the more smooth it'll be. I usually leave that about 8, and then you have lazy radius. This is how far is this line going to lag back behind your brush. So if you have this, you can see it really smooths things out. You can build these really beautiful kind of like line work like this if you're doing detail. Now, until you get used to it, the way that it lags back behind it, it might be a little bit difficult for you to control this, right? So you're gonna have to find your sweet spot. I think I'm usually about 40 for this. It allows you to just I don't know, I can get a whole lot more control over it, especially if I'm trying to do, like I said, some kind of ornate details like this. And so really nice for this stuff here. Okay, the next part is there's a lazy snap. And so that means basically if I did a line here and I had to stop for some reason and I wanted to keep building onto that, if I have lazy snap on, it can actually snap to the very end of this, and this is the like magnetic pole for like how, how close do you need to be for this to work. One thing I've noticed about this, and I'm not exactly entirely sure why this is the case, but if you use a morph target on your model before you start, it helps with this lazy snap. So if you go to morph target area under tool, so we got tool open here, we'll go to morph target, and I will store a morph target. And again, I put that up here on my interface. I use that quite a bit for things. I did notice that whenever we do this and we stop and then we do the lazy snap, and maybe I need to go up a little bit higher with that, I've been getting better results as far as that connecting, and that still is not that great. But let's go here, and I'm just going to keep going from there. Okay, so that's a little bit about how that works. I wish I could tell you definitively how to get just these perfect results, but I've never been able to get just these absolute perfect results with this. So you might have to draw a line, keep drawing on it, try to do your best to connect that stuff up and through there. Now, if we're doing something that's a little bit more organic, or you don't want things to be like these perfect panel lines, like sci-fi panel lines, shouldn't be a big deal. Like if they are not perfect, it's probably maybe a little bit better for the look of it anyways. Okay, the next part is how do we make straight lines? So if you have lazy mouse turned on, if we start to drag out and we hold down shift, you're going to get this line that will drag out, and it does try to snap to these certain degrees. So 45 degrees, 0, and then I believe 90. But if we drag this thing out, I'm still holding down shift, and then if I let go of shift, it'll draw a straight line. So if I'm trying to do something straight here, it's going to start here, just click and drag out, and then immediately hold down shift, and then go here, and then let go. And then I can come here, hold down shift. So I'm click, drag, shift. You got to do it pretty quick. So it's going to take you a few times to try to get that to work that way, like that, right? So there's that for the straight lines. Now, if you don't have lazy mouse turned on, ZBrush's normal behavior for things is if you start to drag out and hold down shift, it'll constrain it, and you can do a straight line based off of like what you're seeing on screen. So I can do a straight line this direction, and if I want, I can hold down shift and I can do a straight line going up and down. Okay, so that's just based off of what you're seeing on the screen. So what if you need an odd angle like going here? So ZBrush has got this weird thing with their camera. This is going to be weird for some people. So hold down shift and then you click and drag and let go of shift while you're in the open viewport, and it rolls your camera. So if you do that, we can then hold down shift and then we could do a straight line that way, right? If you see what's going on here, you can build this thing up over time, and I just don't think you get quite as a clean look as if you've got the lazy mouse turned on. But anyways, so again, the camera, hold down shift, click drag, and then I'm just like dragging up and down and then let go of shift and it turns the camera into roll. You can try to set up your view to be whatever that angle is that you're looking for, and then you can just hold down shift for that. Okay. And then if I do, again, lazy mouse, what we looked at for that is if I just start to click out, then immediately hold down shift, then I can drag out this line, and then I can let go of shift, and it should give me this here. Okay, so that's how I built up the different line work on here. Now, depending on what you want to do with things, you can have symmetry turned on, and you see I've got X symmetry turned on for this, and I don't have it on the back. If I hit undo for that, if we've got symmetry on here, again, this exists under transform. So if we do the transform and then dock it over here, whenever we turn symmetry on, we have the ability to hit X. That's automatically going to happen for you. But if you wanted to turn on symmetry for, like, say, the backside, we can do Z. So now I've got this going on here. If I wanted symmetry in Y, so we can do all those at the same time. Now if I did a line that goes across here, it's going to do a top bottom, and it's going to do it on the back side too. So pretty nice for that. Now if you have all that symmetry turned on and I do a straight line, it's going to double through there. So you just might want to pay attention to that. Everything looks good for me for that, so I'm not too worried about it. I can go to the top view here. I'll hold down shift and I'll do a line here, here, and here, like that. So that goes pretty quick, right? We've got lazy mouse turned on, and if you wanted to start to do, you know, some cool design work, you could try that with lazy mouse, see what your options are. Now, if you notice, when I started to draw, even up here, it was close enough, it started to snap down there to the bottom of that. So that's because of that lazy snap. So maybe for this detail stuff, I just turn that down to 0, and I can start to draw this stuff out. And we'll do this. And I don't feel like I'm the best at this kind of stuff, but as far as like doing these cool designs, I think that's a whole different skill set. Now you can find, you know, examples on the net, and you could find some cool designs and then maybe try to emulate some of that stuff. It's also possible you could turn those into like black and white images for things. So there's a little bit about lazy mouse, how that'll help you with some of the line work that you're trying to accomplish in your design, like that. And yeah, that should give you enough options to try for that. I would also encourage you to try the chisel brush, just like we're looking at. Try Damien Standard. The things I just showed you, they work with all those different brushes, but obviously each brush is going to have a little bit of a different feel to it, and it's going to have a different look to it. I'm trying to do something that feels like a low level carve into something. The other thing to note is this is kind of pixelated, doesn't look all that great. I am using subdivision levels, and if you find, I probably should have done this before I did all this work, but I need to probably add another division level to it. So if I divide this one more time, looks pretty good. Now I could hit clay polish. And again, if I hold down control, that sits under tool, geometry, clay polish, and you could find that basically like right here. But sometimes I find some of the line work that I do, I might hit clay polish afterwards. If I hit undo for that, let's get our division level on there. Now, if we want to be careful about this and we want to say, like, I only want to run clay polish in certain areas, like in some of this detail that I did, I can hold down control and we can paint a mask on there like that. And I'm just going to hold down control and click in here to invert the mask. And then now I can just spam the clay polish on there quite a bit. And I think it produces just like a really, really nice, clean look for a lot of this stuff. And then it gives you a little bit more control over exactly what it is that you're doing with this. So there's a description for you on how you can use Lazy Mouse to your advantage, and you can do some really nice clean line work that way. Okay, let's talk about joining parts and dealing with parts, right? So one thing is if I've got this part here, I'm going to hold down Shift and just click on the eye icon over here, and I'll turn everything off except for this part. And if I got that selected, I can turn the eye icon on there so I can just see those two parts. If we keep these things two separate, we're always going to have this line between them. That makes sense. They're two different objects, but if we join them together, we can do that. Before I do that, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna just make a new folder. I do think if you work with folders, it might make your life easier. I'm just gonna call this main body block, like that. Okay, so that's in this folder. I'm going to click and drag this into the folder as well. So there's a couple different ways that we can merge these things together, okay? One way is if we've got things in a folder, you can have multiple things in a folder, a lot of different things. You can go to this gear icon and you can say Boolean folder, or you can say merge folder, and it'll merge the parts, okay? Now, if you Boolean, it's going to actually cut this shape into this shape and join them and make it a solid. Pretty cool. If you do the merge folder, is this going to merge these two shapes together? It'll merge them down. Okay. The other thing that we could do, if we got a folder group, we can duplicate the folder that you've got. So we can go to duplicate, and I'm going to say OK to this. So it should duplicate the folder for us. I'm going to hide the top one just so we're not working with that, just so I've got a copy. Okay, so we can go through the different options for this, right? So let's just try the merge folder. Okay, so if we do the merge folder, it's going to hide the things in the folder group. It's going to make this new merged object. If I turn it on polyframe, it should still give us the different options that we've got for the different pieces. So if I hold down Control Shift and I click on this piece here like that, you can see it's going to show that part, right? So they're not joined together, right? Let's hide that. Let's show this folder again. Let's go here, just to this one, and let's use the gear icon. And then this time, let's say Boolean folder. Okay. Now, here's the deal. I could do this, but if I do this, remember we're working with dynamic subdivision levels. If I tap D on this, or Shift D, sorry, this is the base cage for this. And then this is, if we tap D, this is going to show us our dynamic subdivision levels. Now, if I merge or I Boolean this folder and just use this option, it's not going to Boolean this high-res thing. It's actually going to Boolean this. And on this one, if I hit Shift D, it's going to Boolean this. So that's what it's going to look like if we tell it to do that. So I'm going to tap D on this, hold down Alt, I'm going to tap D. So there's our dynamic subdivision levels that we've already looked at. Let's just see what that looks like. Let's go here to the gear icon and say Boolean folder. And when it's done, here is this new U mesh that it made. And just like I was saying, it's going to Boolean it together, but it's going to drop it to that base cage, basically, and do that. Okay. So if that happens to you, and if that's what you want, fine, great. Now, if that's not what you want, and you really want the high-res part for this, what we need to do is use the gear icon, and we can say Boolean folder with dynamic subdiv. And if we do that, here's what it's going to kick out. It's going to take a second, and we got this nice clean mesh like this. Okay, so this is what I'm really looking for. Again, like some of the controls exist within here. So like if I had this and I have this and I wanted to merge those two things together, ZBrush does have a whole thing where you can do merge down. So it's going to merge down, like whatever you have selected, it's going to merge this down to that. You know, you could do a merge visible. I've only got those two things visible. It would merge those. I've never really used the merge similar subtool thing. I give it a try. With these two options, it gives me everything that I need. If you're trying to weld points and things like that, you can turn that on. So this will enable UVs and the merge thing. So there's some options for that, right? And just like merging, there's also the possibility of splitting things apart. So if you go to, instead of merge, you can split, and you can do split hidden. So there's always ways to merge things together or split them apart. Okay, the last little part that I really want to show you about this, let's get this version that we have right here. And what I want to do with this is, I was telling you that we always have this CG line that we've got going on here. Even if we told it to, boolean these things together, we still always have this harsh line. Now, what I'd like to do is make the appearance where I can either smooth this out or I can make it feel like there's a weld line on there. What I'm going to do is go to geometry. I'm going to open this thing up and I'm going to use Dynamesh. Now, we did look in the previous videos on how to get started inside of ZBrush and talked a little bit about Dynamesh and Dynamesh resolution. I'm just going to try, like what I've been doing lately is putting on about 1200 when I'm at this level and just clicking Dynamesh. Now you can turn the blur off if you want. I'll just leave it. That kind of smoothens things out just a little bit. Now, if things look pretty good, I usually leave it for that. Okay, so I could turn on, we can tap X for symmetry, and we've been looking at that. And if we want to use symmetry in Y and Z, we can do that. Okay, and now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hold down Shift, and I'm going to smooth along through here. Okay, so no big deal. I think that's pretty standard. Now, that was kind of bleeding over into that edge. I really don't want to do that. We even looked at the whole lazy mouse thing. So if I do Shift on there, let's just smooth this thing out. So we can help get rid of that line. You can smooth that out. It'll make it a little less intense, I guess you could say, for that. Now, the next thing I want to show you is this. I think this is pretty cool. If we put on Trim Dynamic, normally we're like beating up our corners and things like that. And we've already looked at that at the beginning of this video. Now, if you hold down Alt and you click along these corners, it raises it up. But again, to me, this feels more like you've taken those two surfaces and you're welding them together. So I don't know. I think especially for like older metal, things like that, again, anything that feels like maybe it should have been welded together, this is a pretty convincing look for some of this stuff, and it's pretty easy to do as well. So you might want to explore that. Now, if I come back through here, I'm just going to turn everything back on, hold down Shift, and then click on this. And those are all hidden there. So where you still have this, let's go make sure nothing's visible on this stuff here. And I think I've got maybe this visible on there. Okay, so that's how we can take those parts, we can join them together, we can start to make it feel like there's a weld. And again, I would, if I want this to look like this part is one big block of metal, I would have to do the same process for that. And I would have to merge these things down. Now, I guess maybe one last note about this is if you've got subdivision levels on things, if you merge this down with something that doesn't, could that be problematic? I think it'll still do it. So let's move this up in the stack just by clicking this, and that'll move that up. So here I've got that above that shape, and I'm going to merge that down. So if I go to merge, I'm going to say merge down, hit OK. It's going to do it. Now it had subdivision levels on it before, and when I merge that down with this other piece that doesn't, it just kills the subdivision levels. Okay, so just keep that a note, right? And again, if I want to join these together. They're already joined together, but if I want to Dynamesh this, make it into a solid, and I want to get rid of that line, I Dynamesh the whole thing together like that, and then now I can use the trim dynamic, and I can start to do some stuff like this, which I think is pretty cool. So it's up to you how you want to manage your parts. Just know that if you want to get rid of that harsh line that's on there, if you really want to treat it as if it's been something that's been manufactured and it's been welded together, you're going to have to actually join these parts together to get that as a look. Otherwise, it's going to be really difficult for you to get rid of that CG edge that is there. And anytime that you take two surfaces and you just let them intersect and you let them just run into each other, you're pretty much guaranteed you're going to have that. You're going to have that issue and you're going to have that problem. So just something to keep in mind, and just know what you're going after as far as look, and use the correct options for what you're trying to achieve in your sculpt. Okay. Okay, let's continue on with what I would consider the secondary details that you have on here. And we've already looked at the Orb's Crack 2 brush. I want to talk about that a little bit more. So we just looked at how we can do some detailed line work. But what I'm going to do is actually turn off all symmetry. If you take a look at the little tips and tricks from what I showed before on how we can load up brushes from the previous video, we can use Lightbox to get all to the different brushes, and here's all the different orb brushes, right? So I'm using this Orb's Crack 2 brush. You can try the first crack and the third crack brush. You can see which one you like the most for that. We got that loaded up. Now if you tap B, it should be up here within your brushes for what you've been using, okay? So you can use lazy mouse for this. You can turn it off if you want. But if we wanted to start to build the look like this has been split or cracked through, we might build something like this, right? And depending on how you want this to look, you might draw back through over the top. Now I will say I have noticed whenever I draw back through, if I'm not careful, it does a doubling effect and doesn't look quite as clean. Okay, so if you can, try to draw in one continuous line on there. The other thing you can do is you could put it on lazy mouse. We've already looked at if we put the lazy step down pretty low, maybe we smooth this out, but then we have the radius really small. We can basically just still have lazy mouse turned on, and we can just draw with this. And I do get this really nice, you can see the difference between just drawing that by hand and this, what we got here, where we've got this really nice kind of thick to thin feeling for things. Okay, so we've got that. I might want to do an offshoot of this. So I'll go rather lightly and then try to pick up and then maybe do something like that. And then maybe you want to split this off at points like this to make it look like it fissured and cracked even more. So it's up to you how much detail you want on there. So the next part is this. I'm going to tap the command key to open up the light box, and there is also within here, there's an orb pinch brush. So let's grab the orb pinch brush. And what I've noticed about this is if you want to do thick to thins at the end, you can actually pinch the stroke at the very end of it. You can do that. You could do it along the length of this. So if you wanted it to thin up and through here. So it's a way of making more controlled thick to thins as far as what I've been able to tell from this. And maybe I just kind of pull this in through here. The other thing that I found with this is maybe I'm not really happy with the look of that. And again, I'll do this trick way showed over here. I'm going to hold down Control. I'm going to paint a mask on this, and then invert the mask, hold down Control, and just click here. And then I might use Clay Polish. Again, that sits under Tool, Geometry, Clay Polish. It's got its own big button there. And I'll do something like that, and it kind of filters things out and changes the look of things. Okay, so that's how you can do some of the line work and some of the cracks that I've been seeing on there. So the other thing to note is just get reference. Make sure you've got reference up on maybe another screen and you're taking a look at things. I'll show you this real quick. If you take a look at my Gumroad page, same place where I've got the interface on there, so you can do Nick Zook Gumroad. You can get the interface that I was talking about for things, but then I also have some different reference boards. We've already looked at a previous video, this Introduction to Digital Sculpture, the Hammer project, this reference. So there's some good examples on there. But what I'm looking for is this. I've got a reference board for Michael Vicente and in this Orb PureRef. So I think this is like really, really good. You can download that if you want. I believe the discount code for that, if you want that for free, you could just type in UCF student, I believe, and you can get that for free. Some of these things for Gumroad, I just have to charge a certain amount to put larger images and things like that. So I'm not looking to try to charge for that, but it's just part of their system. The other thing is I've got a link on here, and if you go follow the link, all these images came from this great thread that I love, Orb Heroes of the Storm Art Dump on ZBrush Central, and so there's tons of great examples. I just made a PureRef board out of a lot of the different images, and then you can go and you can see there's a link to the brush set within there. So again, I think for my money, this artist is probably my favorite as far as looking at primary, secondary, and tertiary details and the breakup for that. He also puts this really awesome material in there. So if I hit the common key, it's actually, I downloaded it and I put it in here. So if I want the orb material, there's a orb clay. If I load that up, you can see what that looks like. Now, I usually don't suggest these because I know we're not specifically talking about games, but if we were going to bake this as a normal map, what we see for sculpting, the best thing that I found for that was the matte cap gray that was on there, but that got overridden whenever I did this. Here's the orb clay, which gets this nice pickup of highlights and edges. So I tend to think that this can maybe make you think that you've sculpted a little bit more than what you actually have. Now, when you get in the texturing process, maybe you're in Substance Painter and you're using curvature maps and stuff like that, and you're doing certain work to pick up on these edges, you can easily produce this look that we see here. I'll just hit Shift R real quick to do a render on there. But yeah, I think it's a really nice material. So if you wanted to sculpt with that material, go ahead and load that thing up. But yeah, so with the reference and taking a look at what Orb's actually done for his line work, I'm a huge fan. I think he's just kind of masterful at doing just the right amount of detail in the right areas. Most of his work comes from his primary forms, which is the bigger shapes, and then the secondary breakup of like these cracks and fissures and things like that. That's like his secondary work that he has. And beyond that, the tertiary, there might be a little bit of detail that is on there. So in just a bit, I'm going to talk a little bit about the tertiary forms. And usually, if you're not careful, you can really ruin some of the details that you've got. So this medium form stuff, you can see as we get up close, obviously it should work, but a medium level camera distance, you want to make sure all this stuff reads from that distance as well, right? And I do think it becomes this balancing act that you really need to think about. So I've got some detail going on here already. And if I'm going to add some of these cracks and some of these fissures through some of the detail work that I've got, I do need to think about how heavy this stuff is, how much it kind of comes through On the sculpt, maybe I'll make it a little bit larger, tap U and get a little bit more strength on there. Maybe that's a little too much, so I'll knock that back. So I got this kind of going through there like that at this point. And maybe I'll come back this way and then maybe try to make it look like some parts cracked in through there just a little bit. Okay, so again, we need to make sure that that actually reads. And with this detail work and those cracks on there, if I didn't make it as heavy as I did and maybe make the line thickness as big as I did, it's going to get kind of lost. So this is the part that's a little bit tough. This balancing act and knowing um, when you should do certain details and like how heavy they should be. I think that's going to come over time, and you're going to have to probably get some critiques with people and just really start evaluating really good people's work and evaluate your work against theirs and start developing like a critical eye for your own work. And what I tend to think is until you really know what you're doing, I think imitation is the best form of flattery. And if you find really good people's work, try to emulate what they're doing for a while until you understand why are they making some of the choices that they make. And just by doing exercises where you are um, emulating their work, you're actually going to learn something through that process. So I wouldn't view it as like I'm cheating and like I shouldn't emulate their work. And at the beginning, maybe for studies and stuff like that, maybe you're just doing nothing but trying to recreate what they've made, and it's never really going to turn out as great as their work because otherwise you'd be a blizzard too or whatever. So don't feel bad about that. Now obviously you want to make sure you're crediting people for what work they've done. You don't want to be trying to pass this off as your own work. But other than that, at the beginning, I think it's perfectly acceptable to try to learn as much as you possibly can from other people, right? Okay, so real quick on this part, maybe the only other thing that I think might be kind of cool is if I did something like this where you do have the possibility of maybe through masking and things like that, where let's say I paint a mask on this and I hold down Control and Alt and I click on it to tighten up that mask and I hit inverse, so I hold on Control and tap on it, or I hit Control I, either one. Um, and now I'm going to just soften this up a little bit. I'm going to raise this up as a corner. So I'm going to, you can do a couple things. We can put it on the move brush and then we could just raise this surface up just a little bit. That's a possibility. I'm going to hit undo. The other thing that we can do is put it on move. And if I just hold down Alt and click, I can get the manipulator to be right on the surface of that. And then if I hold down Alt, I can move this, I can hold down Alt, and I can basically move the pivot point of this. And then maybe I just rotate this up just ever so slightly to do that. And raise the surface up like that. And if we've got it on Dynamesh, I just hold down Control and then drag and remesh. If I hold down Control, I'm going to paint a mask on here, invert that, and then maybe clay polish to polish that up. And with a combination of that, with like the orbs crack, maybe I'm just drawing. Whoa, that's pretty big. Sorry, gonna do. Let's get rid of this. I'll make my brush size a lot smaller. Maybe I'm just continuing the line for this through here, and I'll continue it here like this. I'll try to run it along the side here like that, and maybe branch this off a bit, just a bit here. And maybe I'm just going to clay polish that part like that and through there. So you could do some pretty cool stuff. I should have been took a little more caution with raising this. You can see that you can tell where I did that. So maybe if I just take trim dynamic or maybe even H polish, I can push that surface back down just a little bit like that. And then maybe to hide a little bit of the work that I did, I can just trim dynamic some of that stuff. And I think that becomes really, really interesting where you've got a crack, but then it also like raised the surface up and things like that. So I think there's some opportunities for you to do that as well. So I know I spent a lot of time on this, and the techniques themselves are not very difficult. They're not very hard, but I need you at the beginning, the beginner level, to start to think about some of these things and think about them as far as design choices and things that you're working on in that realm. Okay. Okay, now that we know a good bit about secondary details, let's move on to the final stage, and that's our tertiary details. So that's the fine level surface noise on the model. It doesn't change the silhouette too much at all. And again, we have to do some kind of balancing act between things. So you've already seen how I did some of this detail work that we've got on here for these cracks and these fissures. And then now let's take a look at doing some surface work. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to show you, hit the Command key. I'm going to go back out, and I want to take a look at the orb brush set that he's got. So there is this orb rock detail, and if we double click that and load that up, this one's a really nice brush, and you can see the stroke type is set to drag rectangle. You can see that this is the alpha that was made on this. And so if we drag this out, it's got a really nice amount of surface breakup. It doesn't really compete too heavily with anything that's we are sculpting, on the secondary side. So that works really well. If you like that, go ahead and use that. Another thing we take a look at is we hit the Command key. He also has this orb rock noise, and if we double click that and load that up, the stroke type for this is spray, and it's got a color to the texture on there. Now, color won't matter unless we actually turn an RGB for this. So it's going to ignore that. The stroke type is spray, so think of an airbrush where it's sending and spitting out like particles. So as we do that, this brush is pretty heavy, so you do want to be a little bit careful about that, and depending on the size of it, it's going to give you the scale. So if we make this really large, it's doing something like that. So it's really changing the surface quite a bit. Now we can control that with the intensity, right? So if we tap U, we can get our slider, and we can drop this down pretty low. And then now I think we can get a pretty decent amount of coverage on here. So this is just going to be almost like a little bit more like a just overall noise on things. I'm just barely tapping the surface of this and making it very light. Now, something that we got to be careful about is if we just put a bunch of noise all over our surface, it becomes tough for our eye to find a place to rest. And that just means your eye just keeps moving all over. It's like searching for some area where it doesn't see all this detail. I feel like our eye is kind of drawn to this detail for whatever reason. So you need to be a little bit careful about that. Now, something that you can do to knock that back, you could put it on the trim dynamic, and you could maybe flatten some areas. So you see we're going to build some areas where it's not quite as noisy. And from a story standpoint, and story basically meaning like trying to build some type of history for this, maybe the dirt or the grime, all that gets built up a little bit more towards the edges, and that tends to happen in real life a lot of times. Maybe these surfaces get wore down where it can be touched and it's being hit over time. And so just knocking some of that back like that can help with that. So we've got something like that. If we want to go back to our brushes and then get the orbs crack 2. I've already got it loaded, so I'll just tap B. It's within there. Um, Maybe at that point, maybe we're doing some really small. I'm just going to turn off lazy mouse, and then maybe we just have some really fine scratches like that. So I'm never a big fan of just taking exactly what the computer has given me. So I like to hand draw a little bit over the top of some of that. So this combination of things, and again, maybe that's a little bit too heavy-handed on things. So we can, like, I'm just doing this instead of smoothing. I can also hold down Alt, and it'll pull up the surface on there. So I can get it just the right depth that I'm looking for, where I can still see some of these scratches, but I don't want it to be that intense on things. So I'm just knocking that back just a little bit like that. Okay. Um, so there's that. The other thing that I've noticed that Orb does, and I'm not exactly sure how he builds these little divots, but I'm just going to put on H polish, put my intensity all the way up to 100, make my brush really small. It's just these little tiny hit marks. That's way too big. Um, and that's probably too big too, somewhere in there. So he's just got these like little things like this every now and then in his surface. And let's make that a little bit larger, maybe 5, somewhere in there. And it probably helps too if some of these sizes of these are varied. So just every now and then in the surface, I'm probably doing too many. Again, take a look at some reference on the reference board to see what that looks like. You could do that. I've already kind of shown this too, where I like to do this with the H polish, where I could do some of the like multiple circles like this and just keep pushing down so it feels like it's been damaged in that area a little bit, something like that. Um, and I could definitely push down and through here like that. And then if I push on this side of it, it tightens things up a little bit for that mark. So there's that. I think if you've got any of these straight lines like this, just breaking this up every so often on things helps. So I'll keep pushing this down and then keep sculpting around this just a little bit. I just think stuff like this becomes a bit more interesting on things. So let you experiment with that, but I think that's a pretty good amount. So the other thing is from far away, this medium camera distance, we want the secondary stuff to show through, and you should probably just see the tertiary barely showing through. So I think um, that brush that Orb has made, this one here, the Orb's Rock Detail, it's amazing for how much detail it can put on the surface. It doesn't change the surface too much. It works from this distance, but then as you get up close, it's got a nice amount of detail too. So I think for me, that's a little bit like the high water mark for where you want to hit for some of this stuff. And again, even if you're using his brush, if that becomes a little bit too intense, maybe you can trim dynamic and push that back. Polish is another brush that you could use on a surface, and you could push that stuff back. So I think any of these work. You could use H polish too. That one's a little, because I put up the intensity of that became really intense. So you just got to think about how much do you want to show through and how much do you need to knock back, things like that. Um, and again, I think that's something that kind of comes over like with time, figuring some of that stuff out. So there's that. The other brush that I wanted to show you, something that just ships with ZBrush. So if we tab B on that, and then we go to N, and then we get a noise brush. This one's pretty interesting. I'm going to go to the back side because there's not a whole lot of detail going on this one. And if we just brush on here, you can see what we get. So if we're not careful, we could be very heavy-handed with that. So if I take the intensity and drop that way down, even at 2, that can be really intense. So watch that brush. I do think it's definitely a very interesting brush. I like it at times, and it just feels like it's very, very strong to me. So I'm going to be just a little bit careful about that, and then knocking some of that back. Okay. The other thing for this is I should show you how to make a morph target. So I've got it on my interface. I can just store a morph target there, hold down control over this. That exists under tool. There's a whole morph target area. So if you go to tool and then we go to morph target, this is where you can store a morph target and you can delete morph targets. So we're basically in memory freezing this shape. Now we can't Dynamesh or anything. If you Dynamesh and rechange the actual geometry, it's all based off of the model and the state that it's in. So you do have to be aware of that. So it's holding it in memory. Now what we can do is this. I want to show you how to do some surface noise. So if we go to surface and open this up, and if I want this open at the same time, I can hold down Shift and click on that, and that'll open that up. So we can go to noise, and it gives you this window that you see here on there. So there is this noise plugin, and if you go in there, there's quite a few different options that you can choose from. I'll just choose the erosion filter for things, and this has got a scale factor and everything else like that for it. I'll hit OK. Now it's got this basic noise mix, and if I put this down to 0, you can see that gets rid of that really fine noise. Maybe you want it on there. If you want that on there, then you can crank that up if you want. I'm just going to put that as 0. Now there's the noise scale. And maybe that's not going to do anything. And if we go to the plugin scale, yeah, that's going to change things quite a bit. So depending on what that pattern is, what you want, I like this idea of it being this really larger kind of pattern, and you've got a strength, and so you could either push it in or you can pull it out. So it's going to be a positive, or you can do a negative on it like that, right? Okay, so I'll go ahead and hit OK. It's not actually applying it to the mesh. This is like a visual representation of things. So they've also got the smooth normals. Let's put that down to 0. Let's see. I don't know if that's really going to help much. So I'll just leave that where it's at. But if you want, we can apply this to the mesh. I did notice that it feels like it's never quite as heavy as like what I'm seeing. So I applied to the mesh, not quite as heavy, but I think if I hit undo for that, you can also mask my noise. So you can either apply to the mesh, and if that is not strong enough for you, you can click noise again and you can apply it multiple times. So it's up to you, right? The other thing we can do, I'm gonna hit undo, and I can do mask my noise, and instead of actually applying it, it will become a mask that we can play with, and you can hold down control and you can invert that. Really up to you what you want to do with that. If I hit control H, we can hide the mask, and then if I put it on the standard brush and I'm gonna hold down Alt, I'm gonna click off lazy mouse. I could push that thing in, but maybe I don't want that to be that strong, so I'll just put that down really, really low to like 2 and hold down Alt, and then start just painting some of that stuff in. So that's a possibility. I'm just going to go ahead and click noise, apply to mesh. So we've got it there, right? So what I usually do is allow it to be put on the mesh. We do have that morph target, and if you go to the morph target area, you can switch between the pre-state that we stored and then this new state that we have. Okay, now if we go to the pre-state and we want to use a brush to brush that in, which is really nice, you can use the morph brush. That sits down here. We can tap B and then go to M. You can find it that way. And then now we've got the ability to basically very lightly, depending where we want to put this stuff, we can brush this thing in. And so we don't have to have it everywhere. And we've got some control over just how intense that is. I'm going to hit undo real quick. There's something else I want to show you about this. And if we get to this part here, we can switch back and forth between this. The other thing that we can do is if it wasn't strong enough, we can push it this direction and it'll make it even stronger. And if we want to just lighten it up, we can click and drag over here to where we can lessen that quite a bit there. Okay, so that's going to allow you to do surface noise and then have some finer level control over things. Okay, to wrap up this part about tertiary, the last thing I wanted to just draw to your attention, we've already looked at using trim dynamic and being able to knock this stuff back, and if we held down Alt, it raises the surface up and fills in some cracks and things like that. And that works rather well. The only thing I wanted to kind of show you on this that I think is pretty neat, we've already looked at how to do these welds and things like that. I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that it's possible to fill in some of these details. I'm going to get rid of the mask here. If I hold down Alt and I go through some of this line work that I've got, I can raise that up and I can pretty much get rid of it altogether. But to me, this feels like this opportunity where if you have these larger cracks within your model, and let's just say over time, dirt and grime and things like that start to actually fill in some of the surface on here, you could start to build, again, what we're talking about, story or history to this model. This makes things look a little bit more believable and a little bit more interesting. Like maybe in my corners, maybe what I've done is brought it in and filled in some of that surface to make it feel like something over time. Got a hold of that and got in these cracks. And so it's just not completely pure and uniform all the way across. It's got some areas of variation, and that breaks things up a bit. Like I was talking about, trying to give your eye some place to rest. Now, if this was a perfectly brand new, just forged out of the metal and carved and everything else like that, then we don't want to be doing this. But that's probably not the thing that you're going to be building. The thing that you're going to be building is probably something that does have some history to it and some aging. And so you want to be thinking about some of this as you're working. And again, I think it's kind of fun. I think it's pretty interesting. And in a way, you become a bit of a storyteller as you're doing your work. And I think it's pretty fun as an artist to do that kind of stuff. So I don't want to fill it in too much on everywhere. I think you probably want to be a little bit selective with some of these techniques that you're doing. But I just wanted to call it to your attention. And again, the goal is to make sure that everything still reads from a medium level detail. And then probably from this distance, you can still see just a little bit of that tertiary detail. It's not too strong. I'll just hit Shift R to do a BPR render real quick on it. So we can see what that looks like for things. And you can still see the tertiary detail that's on there. And we are making sure that we're just balancing what we're taking a look at here for this stuff. So so yeah, it's going to be a process. This is going to be part of your struggle as an artist, and I think as a sculptor, you figuring out how to balance primary, secondary, and tertiary is going to be one of those lifelong pursuits, just like maybe learning how to do anatomy and doing really good anatomy sculpts. Learning anatomy is going to be a lifelong pursuit, and I think doing this type of work is going to be the same thing for you. Okay, so hopefully that gives you enough to chew on and think about as far as primary and secondary and tertiary. And in just a second, I'll load up another version, which is my final version, and we can take a look at that and just do a little bit of discussion about some of the things that I did for that model to finish it up. Okay, to wrap this video up and also this little tiny series up, I wanted to show you the final results of what I ended up sculpting and what I chose for design, thinking about everything that we just looked at, the different tools, techniques, looking at primary, secondary, and tertiary forms and trying to balance those things. And the last thing I wanted to leave you with is a little bit of an explanation of how we can get some quality renders going on here. So I'm just going to hit tab. I'm going to open this up, and you can see on here, if I tap F, I can frame this up. And this was the final model that I ended up creating for this. Okay. So if I open this up, I also made a folder group for the top of the hammer and then for the bottom of the hammer too. So I had to have one object selected out of the group. So it's easy for me to turn that on. If I have live booleans, I did have a shape cut out for that. So I was actually thinking about maybe 3D printing this thing. So I was able to kind of check and see if I've got the top and if I've got the bottom on this. If I turn that on and turn that off, you can see the bottom shape of this. So I just try to be organized with things, actually give names to all the different pieces, some stuff like that. So it's just some housekeeping things. But as far as the shapes, everything that I talked about before on this, I didn't join the shapes together and didn't do any of that. I left these all separate. I did go through the process of taking each one of the shapes. I converted them over from the dynamic subdivision level, and I just sculpted on it that way. So all these pieces were done like that. They're all individual pieces that have subdivision levels on them. So you don't have to sculpt that way. It's just the way that I chose to sculpt. Try to get a good balance of getting these larger primary forms in, getting the secondary forms as far as some design elements that we looked at for how we can do line work, and then how to build tertiary detail for that fine level surface noise, and then making sure that all those elements still worked from about this level here. And if we do a BPR render, just going to hit Shift R real quick while I'm talking about that. All of the elements should still work together and should still read from this level, and even getting up a bit closer like that. Some other things that I did on this that maybe this is not visible. Let me turn those on. I did these little rings. So I just used some primitives and did some rings, and I put those on the top here. That added a nice little decorative element. You can see on these little squares, these spikes that you see there. That was actually done if I put on the standard brush and do a drag rectangle. This alpha that we see within here, this alpha 18 is what I used for that. So if I drag this thing out, let's see, make sure we're on here like this, and I've got a really low intensity, so that's why it's doing that. Could drag that out like that. So that's what was done for that. On those pieces, I was pretty sparing about that. Only put some here and here. Just was repeating some of the shapes that I saw for like these spikes and stuff like that. So I thought it was a continuation of that. And that was pretty much it for like the techniques for actually sculpting. Okay, the next thing I'm going to show you is we could turn the floor on, and if we have the floor on, if we do a BPR render, should render shadow on the floor, so you can either turn the floor on and off whenever you do some of these renders. I wanted to talk to you about some of the options that I usually do for rendering. So if we open up this, I'm just gonna take these and close that up just a little bit. I'm gonna go to render. I'm gonna take this and I'm gonna dock this over here. One thing that they do have on here that I think is pretty cool is they have a preview AO. And so if we turn that on, that's going to give us this nice bit of ambient occlusion that we're going to see on here. This is the settings that I put on there for the intensity on that and everything. So when you actually render with BPR, it actually renders with this stuff. So you can see it in the viewport and you can render with it as well. Some of the render properties, I used to use this ambient occlusion, but if you do that, it'll render ambient occlusion and it will render this preview AO. So that was like doubling up things. So I don't use that. I just turned on shadows. And let me show you the options that I use for shadows for this. So floor strength, I might put it at 0.65 and then a global strength, 0.65. Your ray count might be different. I'm not sure about that. I think the resolution of the shadow should be this. That should work pretty good. I do have it on a blur of 12. If you wanted to drop it down lower, if you wanted a little bit harder edge shadows, but still just a little bit of blur. I don't like how hard edged the shadow information is, like whenever you just use the ZBrush default. So I think that looks pretty good. And again, the global strength of shadow is going to be this right here. And then the floor strength, if I wanted that less, maybe I put that at 0.5. Shift R, you can do that, or you can click this BPR button up here. Either one will work. But that should lessen the amount of the floor shadow that's on there. The next thing I would tell you about is this BPR filters. And I'm not going to use too much on here. If you click the open little donut hole thing, that means you're enabling it. So the first one is got noise. And I just have a very low amount of noise on the image. It's just set to 20. And you can leave it there like that if you want. The other thing is I just sharpen this. So I open up the sharpen one, just open that there, and you can see that's on and this one's on. And if I do that, then it's set to a level of 70 for sharpen. Okay. So that'll give me a nice good render of just this one here. We've already looked at like how we can store camera information. And if you go on my interface, if I hold down control over this, you can see all the camera information stuff exists under draw camera, store camera. So if you just go under draw and it's at the very bottom, you can go to your cameras and you can store cameras and stuff like that. Okay. I wanted to work with like multiple copies of this. Let me show you this little feature that exists inside of ZBrush that's pretty cool for doing layout. So if I move this and I want to take a snapshot of it, I hit Shift S and then I can move this. That's not working correct for the drawing on that. Not really sure why. Let me hit Control N real quick. Let me see if I do this again. Shift S, and then if I move over, yeah, I've got a draw bug right now. But anyways, normally you would just be able to kind of move this, hit Shift S, drag it over. I'm not sure. I'd probably have to restart ZBrush, but it's not worth my time for doing that. But you can do a layout like that. If you hit Control N, it clears the canvas for you on that. Problem is if you do a BPR render, it only renders the last thing that you have on there, the actual 3D object, because the other ones are just drop pixels. Okay, so my workaround for that was this. If I just go to merge, and if you do a merge visible, it will make a whole, if I click this, it'll make a whole brand new object, and it'll say merged something just like this up here, and you'll see that. And so what I did is I took that merged version and then I duplicated it multiple times. I just used the gizmo tool, and I took this and I just took the duplicate version, duplicated it, and then moved it over, rotated it 90 degrees. This is my 3/4 view. And then I made some copies of this so I could see the top and I could see the bottom of this. And then if I push this over here, push this over here, I framed everything up and then stored a camera for that. So if I go to my cameras, this is my 3-up camera that I did like that. And if I hit tab for that, so then I've got real objects for each one of these. If I hit Shift R, then it's going to treat it as if I've got a bunch of different copies of this, and I can just render it like that. and that looks pretty darn good. Okay, so there's a couple different ways that you can get these images outside of ZBrush. So they've got a Z plugin, and if you go to the Z plugin, they've got the ZBrush to Photoshop. And if you wanted to kick out, this is the BPR render, you could kick out a depth pass, you could kick out a mask, and also shadow. There's a whole lot more you can do with this. I'm not going to get too in depth with this, but at the very least, if you just want the BPR render to kicked out, you could do this. You do have to tell it where Photoshop exists. So if you click on that, it's going to ask you to navigate to where Photoshop exists as the exe on your program files. You'll have to navigate to that once, set it up. Once it's done, then it just sends this stuff automatically to Photoshop from ZBrush. Pretty cool plugin. So something you might want to take a look at. It's possible that it kicks out different render passes for polygroup ID, subsurface scatter, all these different things you can turn on. So this is really powerful. So that's one way of getting things out. The other way is if you go to Document and you say Export, you can export this out as a JPEG. You can do it as a Photoshop file. If you do it as a JPEG, whenever you hit save, it's going to give you a dialog, and you can actually crop on there. You can give the quality settings for the JPEG. So there's a lot of options there. You can do as BMP or PNG. If I'm working with Photoshop, and that's normally how I do things, I like to kick that out as a Photoshop document. So you can kick that out as a render, and then you can pull it into Photoshop, and then you can do some comping there. So that's a couple different ways for you to get up some decent looking renders. They'll look very nice. This is the quality of just what I've got on there. I've got the just this matte cap gray on there. Now we have looked at this where if I went into the materials, if I did go to the orb material and I do a render of that, you can see it's going to look very similar, except for my edges are going to be a little bit more highlighted on there. So if you wanted to do that as an option, that's an option for you as well. But all those options that I just showed you, even if you don't have a great understanding yet of how ZBrush renders, and I don't think for showing off this kind of level of your models, I don't think you really need to know that much. I think with these options that I just showed you there, you're going to get a really good, decent look, and you're going to be able to pull that into Photoshop, and you're going to be able to manipulate the image there further if you want to do that. And this should be pretty much all you need as a 3D modeler to show off the quality of your high-res models that you have. Okay, so I hope everything that I've shown you in this little video series with these two videos gets you up and running, helps you understand how to do primary, secondary, and tertiary forms, how to use some of the different tools that they've got inside of there, and when you're done, being able to set up a decent looking render inside of ZBrush for things. One last thing I just want to make sure, because maybe I've changed this on here. If you go to draw, let's see, we've got document. We can change our background color, and I don't have a gradient on there. I don't like a gradient with my background. You could take the range, and then here's some of the settings that I've got for this on here. So you can play around with these and you can see what they do. They're going to control the gradient, how strong the gradient is, where it sits and all that. And you can choose your background color. I'm just doing some very simple stuff. So those are some more additional options that you might want to be able to take a look at and look into. And the other last thing that might be a little bit weird about ZBrush, if you're going to do some of this rendering stuff, if you want to control the width and the height of your document, you might have to turn this proportion button off, set this number, and then you can resize. If you do that, you will need to probably do this. If I hit T and accidentally switch to 2D mode, I'm going to switch. And you might get in this mode where you're like, what is going on? I'm just keep drawing this stuff. Your cursor is white and you're drawing on the canvas like this. ZBrush started off as a 2.5D paint program. And so you're really just drawing that 3D model onto the canvas as pixels. Like think about like you're in Photoshop and then you're just filling your layer with like a brush. That's kind of what's happening here. So if you hit Control N, that clears the canvas. If you want to get back to that 3D mode after you resize your canvas, just draw one copy on the screen here, hit T, to go into edit mode, and you're back into the 3D mode, and your cursor should be red for you at that point. Then you could just tap F to frame things up, or you can click your camera views, whatever you need to do. But that is a way that you can go. You can change your document resolution, the aspect ratio, and everything else like that. But it does trip people up the first time that they're doing this and trying to understand this concept that ZBrush's canvas is really a 2.5D canvas, and that's the way the program started. Okay, so I threw out a lot at you, but again, I think there's enough information for you to get your feet wet with all this. You're going to be able to make a really good design and have a pretty good understanding of how the program works. And really, with what you're doing here, you're setting up the foundation for you to be able to build professional looking work.